Hello, everyone. I'm Jeff Haas. Myself and Tom Martin have put together the slide deck, and Tom will be driving a portion of it, and I'll be driving a different portion. So we'll be taking turns, and please feel free to interject questions as we go along. This is intended to be somewhat interactive. And as soon as I can figure out how to change slide, I believe first slide is Tom's.
All right, thanks. I guess we'll just start off with what is project management? Why do we even care about it? Most of you probably know, at least at a high level. But it's really just the application of processes, methods. It's best practices in some sense for how to achieve the objectives in a project, and to make sure that stuff happens in an orderly fashion, and that if there's obstacles, that they are dealt with in a timely fashion. That there are no kind of surprises or train wrecks near the end when all of a sudden people realize they can't actually meet the objectives in the timeline that they had predicted. So project management is a discipline. There's formal certifications. There are people that make careers out of this, basically. I think the full formality is overkill for what we need as working group chairs. Nothing wrong with it, but it's not really required. But I think that the key to take away is that the core ideas behind project management are very useful and can and should be applied to the way you manage your IETF work. And so the purpose is really to encourage chairs to think about project management as a way of organizing what they're doing in their working groups and for trying to steer work in a productive fashion in terms of the working group. Next chart. All right, so what are the key project management activities? There's really sort of three parts that are all important. The first one is to identify the goals, and that is exactly what it means. If you don't really have clear goals, you're not going to achieve them. And what I like to do, or the way I look at this, is ask yourself, where should the working group be in 6 months from now? 6 months from now, looking back, what do you want to have seen happen? And it's also useful, for example, say like a year from now, looking back, how will we decide whether we've been successful as a working group or whether we have been unsuccessful or disappointing as a working group? And usually that means you want to have some deliverables, you want to get some documents out the door, you want to have some tangible progress. Well, set those goals, identify what they are, and the next step is to actually organize a work plan. Once you have a target, how do you actually organize the work in such a manner that you hopefully will meet your goals? And that corresponds to developing kind of a timeline, having some checkpoints, making sure the checkpoints actually make sense, that if step A has to happen before step B, make sure that step A is given priority so that step B isn't delayed because the work in A hasn't started yet. And it's identifying owners, who's going to take the token, who owns the action item, get commitments from them that they are going to be able to deliver in a reasonable time frame, that it works with their schedule. They're not promising something they can't do, and turn them loose. And the final step is really execution of the work plan. This is sort of the day-to-day, week-to-week, tracking what's going on, making sure the checkpoints are being met. If checkpoints are slipping, nudge the parties, go poke around. What's the reason for the delay? Is there something we can do to address that? Have something new come up that changes the plan, or even in some level, should the goals change? And the key point here is that the chairs need to actively manage their work. They need to be active chairs and not just sort of passive and wait for the working group and the document authors to come along and write a document. Sometimes this means going off and finding some authors and saying, hey, we need a draft in this space. Can you do it? Can you find some other people to go do it together? And can you get it done by a certain date so that we can discuss it on the mailing list and then have a set of open issues to discuss at the meeting? And another thing that's always worth emphasizing is don't be afraid to have the working group involved in this by reviewing, what your work plan is, providing feedback on the priorities and things like that. Because this all works well when everybody is bought into what the work plan is. They all agree the priorities are right. They want to see it happen. And when people are bought into something like this, they generally are more likely to actually deliver because they know other people are waiting for them. And they also know that when they deliver, they're going to get feedback and in a timely fashion so they can go on with their work. All right, next chart. So I've talked about this a little bit already. The first step is setting the goals. And for this, I encourage people to look at the big picture. Always ask yourself, what do you have to do to be successful as a working group? And that isn't just looking at what's in your charter. Sometimes it's like asking yourself continually, is the charter right? You know, and maybe the charter is scoped very narrowly, but you have larger goals. Make sure that you are keeping the larger goals in mind and that you're taking steps that will let you get to those larger goals. It's worth remembering, don't confuse activity with progress. Lots of times you get lots of drafts in an area and there's actually no real progress. There's no real plan for how you, merge those drafts into something the working group can actually work with. Looking in the future, how are you going to declare victory versus failure? And in particular, look for gaps. Are there work areas that are needed for the working group to be successful as a whole that people aren't actually looking at yet, or that they say, yeah, we need something there, but nobody's actually doing work there because there's other documents that are kind of easier to work on? And always keep your eye on the 8 ball. You have core documents that are critical to get done. Usually those are the ones that are in the charter that are highlighted. Make sure you focus on getting them done and not just kind of letting it plod along. And a good example is like a problem statement. If your charter is a new working group and you have a problem statement, get it done in 3 to 6 months. If you've got a problem statement hanging around a year after the working group's formed, that's not a good sign that you're keeping focus on the 8 ball. Okay, next chart. And at this point, we're going to break it up into sort of more detailed components, and I'm going to turn this over to Jeff to talk about some of that.
Thanks. So the next couple slides are talking about things in terms of what are the components of project management. Terminology that's used in here is a little bit more the standardized type of thing that you'll find if you pick up a project management book. So if the words seem a little bit weird, that's where they're coming from. So project management tends to view things in terms of artifacts. What are the things that you're actually managing? For IETF, most of it's documents. Although what we consider a document may actually vary. So some of these things are going to be the formal stuff that we have in IETF process, like internet drafts. But some of these things are also living documents, wiki pages, stuff in version control repositories, stuff that's been brought up in mailing lists, that sort of thing. Tracking the artifacts is a huge portion of the work for actually executing project management on a given set of tasks. So, Thomas brought up that we're trying to actually execute on the goal. We have things that we're trying to do. What are the incremental steps that get us there? The important thing is that the chairs or the working group secretary are the ones that ultimately own tracking responsibility for the artifacts. You want to know who owns the document. In most cases, that's the people who are the primary authors, but if you're having problems with authors not making progress, remember that the document actually belongs to the working group and you can appoint a new editor if necessary. Where is the document? That's an important question, especially when things are stalling out, because if it's on somebody's personal computer, it means that you're sort of stuck with that person as primary author, even if you have a productive set of other authors. In a better world, in my opinion, this stuff should go into version control repositories. IETF does maintain SVN access. GitHub has become very popular. Doesn't matter if it's inside of IETF resources or not. Get it out in the public so that people can actually contribute. And one of the sort of useful things this lets you do is allows people to submit patches against stuff, and that way you can actually have people incrementally adding to the document, even if they don't have edit privileges. So tracking issues is another big maintenance chore, and this is something that IETF is very mixed about. We have the track tool. I happen to load the track tool. I suspect that a lot of people are not very fond of it. The NetMod group actually solved their problem just simply by sticking a text file in a nice structured format in their SVN repository. Wiki pages are really good for tracking stuff, but the problem is wiki pages are the kinds of things that people have a tendency to put stuff in there and they don't actively maintain them. If you want to use a wiki, that does mean that you need to sign up to actually maintaining it and not leaving dusty history. The data tracker is, especially with the recent changes we had in the last couple of years, does a really good job about tracking where IDs are in the RFC lifecycle. What would be sort of nice is to have the hooks into some of these things to be able to execute tracking things that are not specifically IDs or other portions of the RFC lifecycle for working group project management. With your artifacts, biggest thing you need to worry about is they've broken down into some sort of task. Tasks have dependencies. In the case of our RFC process, we know what those most dependencies actually are for documents. The important thing about the work in general is that, work tends to have different types of fate sharing. I'm not going to go through each of these specific things. This is terminology that tends to show up in project management. But, for the most part, we tend to have, finished and finished type dependencies. We can't actually declare, our goal done until we've actually executed a full set of things. So in practice, our dependencies are not only necessarily in your working group, but they spider off elsewhere. And part of that problem is that, if you depend on somebody else's draft in progress, or you depend on other work that's in progress in a different working group, you have to coordinate that, and you're also responsible for tracking that locally for your task, along with coordinating with the other group. Using standard project management dependency terminology is really frustrating and actually sort of hints at the tools problems that we have, because IETF work tends to be highly parallelized. What you should be asking yourself is, can you start a piece of work? If you can't, what's holding it up? Is this work finished? Does it finish alone, or does it depend on a group of things? And typically, you tend to find these things, being very common issues. There's usually gating documents, like you can't start on something until your problem statement is complete. You can't finish things until the whole package is done. So as Thomas mentioned, timetables, milestones, those are really important things. IETF tends to have a bad habit of doing one draft per meeting. One thing that project management can help with that is it can keep things moving along. Ideally, we're making progress by revising things 2 to 3 times during a meeting. This means we need to know what the final product is, and if we're not seeing progress being made along the execution of that, people should be reminded that work is not happening, and try to nudge them along. This means that we need a work plan with reasonable checkpoints that actually have tagged the key contributors, and the working group is continuously pulled in to actually look at the work. And this means that the people that are involved in a specific piece of work have to understand their dependencies among other components. Timing is a big problem in IETF in general. We tend to call it cat herding for a good reason. And one of our biggest problems is that IETF is not usually somebody's first job. It's usually a second job at best. And day job work and the scheduling that's associated with day job work is going to frustrate things getting done. What that means is you need to be very realistic about deadlines. Don't expect any work to happen during the week after IETF, and everybody has a day job, but that also means that people are not off the hook for getting stuff done. If they're signing up for the work, they need to be executed. They need to let you know when they can do that. Not necessarily that it can be done in a specific time frame, but if it can't be done when you're expecting it to, when would it be done? In terms of helping to manage that work, knowing calendar impact actually is something that the project manager should be aware of, and that should trickle down to the appropriate document owners when necessary. Our big moving points tend to be the IETF meetings. We know what these meeting dates are years in advance, and realistically, we tend to have our cutoff dates as something that should help drive documents as completion. So that's a point on the calendar when we expect things to be done enough. Holiday schedules tend to also complicate things, and given the multicultural nature of the IETF, that can be really tricky. There's the end of year holidays. There's a lot of people that are effectively off for the last 3 weeks of December and the first week of January. If you're in one of the Eastern cultures, you're probably off for Lunar New Year. A lot of Europe seems to take off the month of August. If you happen to be over towards India, you have things like Diwali. It's not a comprehensive list. It may actually be worth our while to write some of these dates down, just simply to help people understand this when they're building out their project plans. The important thing is, ask the people that are working on a given task, what is the obstacles in the calendar that might keep them from getting work done? It's also useful to frame buffer time around the actual conferences. We have our cutoff date. Work should be done 2 weeks before the conference. We want people to be able to use this time to read documents. We know there's a practice of people getting stuff done at the very last second, and sometimes, once the list opens up again, people are publishing on the Monday of conference week. It's just reality, but it's a date that we're trying to actually move people to. Asking people to do work immediately a week after IETF is not a helpful thing. Some people are just catching up on work and some people are taking vacations. And of course, there's the fun that depending on what type of work you do, IETF may be aligned conference-wise with the dates of other conferences, things like MPLS, IEEE, ITU, et cetera. So again, know your participants, know what they're working on, know how it interacts with the calendar. In terms of execution, it's really a matter of who's working on something, what is the thing they're working on it, when is it due, or when they actually expect to be able to do some component of it, and are they aware of the dependencies? And if they're expected to produce revisions on a given time frame, nail the date on the calendar. If they don't make that date, if it slips, then that potentially has impact on other work. It's not necessarily the responsibility of the person who's working on a given task, a given document, to be specifically aware of the impact that their lateness on something will have on somebody else. That's your job as the project manager or the chair. But ideally, if they're aware of this sort of thing, they can take it into consideration, and hopefully that sort of motivates them to get things done on time. A lot of the job of the manager, specifically the chair, is remind people of their work. You're not a manager in the traditional sense. You don't have the ability to hire them or fire them. The best you can do is do all the things that IETF does very well in terms of motivation. Everybody shares responsibility, and ideally remind them of things like the dates, the dependencies, and most importantly, they're not your employee. Nudge them along. Don't try to be the scolding parent, because end of the day, for the most part, we still are a volunteer-run organization. I also tend to encourage people that we want the work to happen as publicly as possible. It's not only good IETF practice, but it means that if people are doing stuff on mailing list or closed mailing list or in some version control repository, something that lets you actually get stuff that you can see in a public fashion, you can actually track it even if you're not getting regular status reports from people. And what that means is we need to provide resources for this. Provide version control. Doesn't matter if it's the IETF version or GitHub. If you're having trouble maintaining this yourself, get a secretary. If you have a lot of people coordinating things and it's this gigantic BCC chain, get a public mailing list. And more importantly, the archive will actually help people figure out what had been happening as well. So in terms of execution, use the work plan, track the activities. Don't assume that silence is actually meaning everything is okay, because in many cases it means they're so busy they're not paying attention. Nudge the authors, have status calls. The important thing is as you're working through things, adjust your work plan as circumstances change, and it's going to change. If necessary, recruit other people to help you do the work. And very important, Thomas articulated, goals are the things that we're actually working towards, and all these things that I've been talking about are just the ways to get there. Now revisit the goals. Make sure that you're still on not only track for what you had set out to do, but whether that's still the right thing to do. Now in terms of the actual tracking is the most important thing you can do. Again, it's who, what, when, and dependencies. And much of this is just simply building lists. The working group milestones that you can put in a data tracker are helpful, but they're usually very coarse granularity. If you're looking at traditional project management framework, this is the finish to finish milestone that you're looking for. The working group document tracker is actually very helpful because once there is an ID, you can track the progress of things, but especially in that early iterative work, it's really not the right tool. Public tracking of issues is also helpful. One of the things that I tend to do for BFD is I stick things to the wiki, and it sort of gives an idea of what the status of the working group is perceived by the chairs. And as far as list goes, something that's on the calendar is also a list. Now, in terms of tools, single biggest thing I find helpful is to make sure that my tools nag me. If the tools don't actually catch my attention, if something doesn't beep, then I may end up missing it. And as some other people are aware of, they'll get this flurry of emails somewhere around 9 or 10 a.m. on Mondays as my various things beep and I send out status emails after I've done checking on things. One of the things I tend to do this sort of thing is the Mac to-do application. Very simple. It does the what's, it does the when's, and it allows me to check off dependencies. It's a very simple application, nothing very complicated, and it does the job. There are still opportunities that IETF could do to add something to the data tracker to do that sort of work. Defining those requirements, I think, will come as we actually do a little bit more work as a set of chairs to figure out what are the methodologies that work out well for us as a whole rather than for individuals. And just to give an example, this is what my to-do tends to look for the BFD, the list of tasks, sometimes they're associated with them, and various notes. Now, of course, no talk about project management is going to finish without actually talking about, what about Microsoft Project or your favorite project management software. If you actually know how to use this sort of thing, and you know how to use it effectively, because there's a lot of people that use it just because they're told to by their management, and they're not necessarily good at tracking things, this talk probably wasn't for you. If you can use it, that's great. Our workflow, unfortunately, tends to make it a little bit tricky to use things in terms of traditional project management, for things like Microsoft Project. We have so many things going on in parallel. The dependencies are loose in some cases, and the rigorous formalism that comes out of those sorts of things makes it really tricky to use that tool. And in terms of visualization, this is another thing that comes out of typically the output of Microsoft Project, but there's other tools out there. Gantt charts are helpful for tracking projects, but the problem is, again, the type of work that we do is not really effort-based in the traditional sense of things. You don't say that some person is going to work on a draft, it's going to take them 1 week, and they have dependency on somebody else, and therefore this is when everything is going to be done. At best, what you could get out of this type of methodology is using the tool to track points on the calendar, people that are working on things, general dependencies, and the work itself effectively should be treated as taking no time at all. For the most part, it's not a tool that I recommend for IETF purposes. And with that, that's the contents that we had for the presentation.
Comments, questions, thoughts?
I've noticed now, Jeff, you have one fairly extracurricular, seamless BFD working group, but now you have one that's pretty active, lots of stuff going on, lots of critical decisions, applied to RS. How much of what percentage of your time do you spend on IETF now that you have IR2RS?
So to give the honest but frustrating answer, prior to Sue jumping in to help out, I was spending something on the order of about 25% of my time, which was well over the budget that I had originally allocated. And Sue thankfully dove in and is able to spend a little bit more of her contiguous time on it. The problem with I2RS is actually a good example. The group was effectively floundering. We had stuff that we wanted to do, but not necessarily the good answers about how to get there. And what Sue has sort of driven is nailing down dates, nailing down the who, what, and when, all the things that are necessary for the project management, and just getting things moving along. Being able to actively coordinate people is probably the single biggest thing that she's done to improve the flow of the working group.
Yeah, okay. So you're spending about less than 25 now on the two working groups. Not including IETF.
I would say I'm spending about 15% now that Sue is actually taking load off, and honestly, the project management stuff is a fair amount of work, mostly up front. And once you've actually established the contents of things and managing the cadence of it, what the things are. The job of actually managing at that point becomes keeping people moving along. You have to read the drafts, you have to push people to respond on things. You have to make sure that if something appears to be stalled, nudge them.
Yeah. I find there's, things, the reasons things get, there's basically, and you can have variations of this, about 3 reasons why a draft stales. One is, of course, the best one. You're having trouble, not the best, but it means people are actively engaged and things are going well. I mean, at least you're working on the right thing. You're having trouble agreeing on the finer points of it. That's one, reaching consensus. The second one isn't such a good one. It's you have this kind of work and you can't get really, it seemed like people supported it, but now when it gets down to closer to the end, there's not really that many people interested in the draft, and if it's something complicated, there aren't people interested in implementing it, or they don't have the, the economic push to implement it. And the third one is where the authors get too busy. This is the one the project management really addressed as well, and you can nudge them, to respond to comments and to do the necessary steps to get a quality document. I think those are the 3 main, there's variations of those, but I think those are the main reasons work takes longer than it should.
Yeah, and I actually like to expand on your second point a little bit. The problem that we tend to have with documents that had a lot of energy to start with and not a lot of energy at the end, it's either because it's stopped being interesting to the working group, which I'm going to guess maybe happens a third of the time. Mm-hmm. But the other portion of it is that once people have actually done the hard portion of the work, this is an execution thing, dotting your I's, crossing your T's, doing the reviews, making sure that everybody's actually added the language, everybody's made sure that things are actually logically coherent, all the stuff that effectively is part of the shepherding effort before it actually gets to an actual shepherd is part that people don't want to do. And that's part of the cat herding of a volunteer organization. There's not a lot of incentive that we provide for people to do that portion.
Mm-hmm. So, Thomas, let me just jump in and say a couple things here. I mean, what project management techniques can help you do is identify when something is a little bit off track, when you're not meeting your goals and your targets, and that should force you to step back and say, what's going on here? What is the real problem? And then the reasons are all, as you're saying, there's lots of reasons why drafts get stalled and so forth. But as a chair, it's an opportunity to say, like, well, if a document is at the end stage and we're having trouble closing it, maybe the right thing to do is get somebody else to do the closure. And this is often a skills thing. There are some people that are great at doing the first 75% of a document, doing the hard part, getting the technical stuff, and they just aren't good at the dotting the I's and crossing the T's. But other people could be, because it's a different kind of job. It doesn't necessarily require the same skill set that doing the initial versions of the draft and getting it, kind of roughly into shape. And it's a good way to grow somebody new. You test them out, and so if you have goals and you have milestones and you're missing them, it gives you an opportunity to say, well, maybe we need to change what we're doing here. And I kind of encourage people to do that. There's a lot of times there's a hesitancy of, like, adding authors or moving people around. But if the work isn't getting done properly, that's really what the chair should do. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying, look, this is not what you're good at. Let's hand it over to somebody else who's much better at dealing with with the IETF last call and running it through the ISG and stuff like that. Because the document has to get done. Again, keep your eye on the 8 ball. If the document is really important, it's got to get done. If it's not getting done, maybe it isn't actually really important. Maybe that's another discussion to have and get back to the goals.
This is Sandy. I was struck by Jeff talking about an openly available repository, particularly in light of you're just talking about perhaps adding or replacing authors on a document. If you don't have a public repository of the XML that underlies the published draft, you're kind of stuck. I don't know of an IETF tool that will take an internet draft and produce the XML. Does anybody else know of such a tool? Second question, how, if you have a problem with an author who is not responsive, not dealing well with comments, or has been assigned other duties, does one replace them or add an additional editor and make them the primary author? So there's two questions there.
I can respond to one of them. Michael.
Go for it.
The DHCP v6 BIS document had a tool produced that was used to actually turn the RFC itself back into an XML document. It's not great. It was done specifically for that, but I've used it for 2 other documents, and it works pretty well. But expect to spend a couple hours cleaning it up, but as opposed to several days converting it. And it's some Python, and it's on GitHub, and I can point you at it if you like. And as for the second half, where we've done this once or twice now, Inez, I can't remember. I guess we've done it twice with 2 documents in the role working group. And the answer is that the person has been introduced as an author marked editor. And the only consideration in my mind for removing a person as an editor, as an author, and putting them as a contributor is if you essentially they are completely unresponsive, because one of our documents spent 6 weeks in auth 48 because we couldn't get the authors to actually acknowledge that they were ready, and that was really annoying. And in hindsight, I would have removed several of them as authors had I known they were going to be so unresponsive. I had to phone them like several times.
Let me just say that on the authorship, editorship, that's a complicated discussion, and there's a lot of it depends is the answer. Because, as a chair, what you want is you want the documents to go forward, and sometimes you basically you've got to get a new editor for the document who's actually gotten the text and is going to make changes and so on just to get it done. But who's the actual authors listed on the RFC? That's a big deal. And just because an author isn't responsive for 2 months doesn't mean you should take them off as an author. If they've done the primary work, and they should get credit for that. And I'm not saying should. I mean that the IETF process in some sense requires that. You have to. It really just does depend. But the big question for a chair is if the current editors, authors, team that hold the pen aren't delivering, you've got to step in and do something about it.
So I agree with all that. Can I pick up on the XML translation? And I've had to do that on several documents. I've used the XML Mind tool and just cut and pasted it in there, and no more than 2 or 3 hours to do it. So I found it actually quite easy to get from a regular text to XML if you use a decent tool.
I'd also say when you upload a draft, you have the option of uploading the XML as well as the text, and that's something that you can, I believe, check on and request that your authors do in the working group just as a matter of course to help make it available. This is also useful to people who have things.
Have we stopped the bug where I recall that getting deleted when a draft expired?
I have not gone to look and verify, so I do not know for sure. It's the other piece. So I'm not sure on that. That's something we can check on, Stuart. The second thing I'd say is if an author becomes unresponsive, remember we do have AD overrides for things like during auth 48. If someone's done a lot of work, yes, absolutely, they should get the recognition and stay as an author. That doesn't make them the main editor. The authors have given over by accepting that it's becoming a working group draft. They've given over editing to the working group. And absolutely, if what's necessary is to appoint an editor to drive things forward and make it happen, that's one of the tools that you have. And I suspect that fewer of doing that may be necessary than you would think, because people will notice it's happening.
Thank you for the answers. I think Tom made the point that I expected, which is that for the IPR issues, it's important to keep people recognized in some way as having contributed to the document, and because they have to make the statement that they don't know of any IPR issues during working group during the RFC editor phase or before publication. I actually expected the answers that if someone's unresponsive, you do need to consider adding someone. I was hoping to hear war stories of how often this has happened, how often it, how much leeway you should be allowing people and such from actual experience of having done it. Very interested to hear about the tools. Yes, I know probably just copying from the text version into an XML template would work. If your document is more than a certain number of pages, that's probably not scalable. Michael, I would appreciate a pointer to that tool that you mentioned. Probably the working group chairs list as a whole would appreciate a pointer.
Sandy, I think cutting into and pasting into an XML template would be a horrible story to do. I was referring to cutting and pasting into XML Mind, where most of the XML is hidden from you. And indeed, it's part of my campaign that we need to get serious in the IETF about having proper tools.
Thank you. I've never used that tool, so I wasn't aware of how much it helped you out in only exposing the good stuff.
Yeah, I mean,
which is the hard part.
Basically, it's got things for constructing lists for you. You just click a button and a list gets constructed. It's got, it knows about the section numbering and stuff. So you just say, please create a new section, and you can indent it by to make embedded sections lower and all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
So mostly what you're doing is to just grab the text from the from one screen and drop it in, decide whether you need a new section or a new subsection, click a button to create that, and drop another lot of text in, and then decide whether the hardest part is actually lists and getting them set up. Right. Figures, you just cut and paste and drop into a figure.
Okay.
Really easy.
Yep.
And a great use of ITU meeting time.
Even for a 50-page document?
I've done 20 pages, and I've done 20 pages while sort of, waiting for my turn to speak in some very boring meeting.
I'm actually kind of surprised to hear this discussion. I mean, how common is it to have to reverse engineer a draft to be able to get the working group pen control back? I mean, to me, that seems like an outlier.
Well, hang on a second. There's two things. First off, it's happened several times that the authors had to change. Most recent time when I did it, I agreed to take over it was a PV3 document because the authors didn't really have time, and but they've been using NROF or something else that I wasn't very happy with, and so the quickest thing to do is to just chop the text file into an XML file.
Oh no, okay, I get that. I thought I was more asking about the question where the original authors of a draft, an IETF draft, you can't get them to produce the actual text, and so you have to reverse engineer it from an internet draft. So I get that. I mean, I have the same problem with.
I think the case is that they're AWOL. They're really, you bugged them and bugged them and bugged them to produce a new draft. It's now expired, and 3 months later, if you just can't get them to respond. And so getting the doc, but you still have the text. They had to post the text. If anything, what would be interesting is if we could, on the submit tool, if you're submitting a working group document, if it could insist on the XML, that would be really nice, but probably would not make people like Joe Touch happy.
No, that's not going to work, right? Because I'm sure on this call we have XML people, NROF people, and pure text people.
And Word people. Don't forget the
Say
Word
again?
people. There's a lot of
and
people
the Word
that are
people.
producing Word documents from Word, and they have no XML steps. So.
But maybe we could make some change to the tracker, to the tool, so that instead of insisting on it being XML or whatever the other form it takes is, you could have another one which is basically just put in whatever you have here and we'll work it out later.
That would also work for me, and I'm suggesting it on a working group by working group basis even.
Well, let me just observe. I think we've rat-holed a little bit on a side topic that's kind of removed from the original purpose of the call. That's good at one level, but let's not lose sight of the purpose of this call here.
So something I'm slightly worried about with project management is that we all have a desire to go faster, but sometimes the cake takes the length of time it takes to bake, and sometimes the thought process that happens during the delay is an integral part of producing a better document.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, and the way I would say that is where I always say be reasonable on your deadlines, and I mean that seriously. That means don't expect always expect a minimum of 2 weeks for the working group to be able to discuss an issue. Expect a week for the chair, for the document authors to have something in response to the working group. Be realistic about those kinds of things, and never ever think, oh, we're going to post it to the mailing list, we'll get feedback in 3 days, revise it, and get it in, because that's the way you do bad work. And so, but if you from a project management perspective, again, go back to a document. You have easily 3 to 4 months between IETF meetings. There's no reason why you can't get at least 2 revisions between IETF meetings, and preferably 3. And part of the problem is that people save up changes to the very end because they're like, oh, it's not worth doing the revision because there's not much text. It actually is. The quicker you make a revision and get in a document and get people reading it, the sooner you're closing an issue and the less likely you're going to have somebody read the old broken text and spit out the same issues. And so in some sense, by having a small amount of work going on steadily over time, you're going to make much more progress than having a lot of activity only 3 times a year. But be very pragmatic about deadlines and what people can actually deliver.
So that aspect I completely agree with, and the rule that I was taught early on and I abide by is let the tracker do the work. He doesn't care how many revisions you have. However, I still go back to sometimes it takes the time it takes, and we need to remember that. So, you can be staring at an issue for 6 months, and then you realize that, oh my goodness, I made a day 1 error here. Oh
yeah. So plan for what's pragmatic and adjust your goals if you can't actually meet them. I mean, just because there's one big issue just because there's one issue the work group can't seem to deal with for many, many months, there's probably lots of other issues you could resolve, in parallel and put them to bed.
The other thing, Stuart, is that I find one of the problems is the lag time between responses. I think about this as how many people have the state relevant for that draft swapped into their head at the same time. If everyone has read the draft fairly recently and remembers the issues, you can have good conversations that happen quickly. If not, then you end up dragging out and one person times out while the other person is loading state in, and a conversation that could have happened in 15 minutes in the hallway if everyone were up to speed, or happen, in a week on the mailing list, can end up taking months or years, right? So by setting deadlines, you also set expectations for when people need to think about and discuss things and make sure they have state relevant for particular drafts in their mind for really active discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. And sort of one of my examples is, and we don't do this often enough, I think, is it's actually very helpful when you just to revise text in one section of a document and post it to the list before it's in the draft. Say, here's straw man text, and you'll often, because people can digest 2 or 3 or 4 paragraphs, they'll read it and give you feedback right away, and you can iterate really quickly, and bang, you've got something done in a week or 2 that otherwise might take an IETF cycle, and you won't have gotten it right.
I agree with that. And something else I've something I've sometimes done is, if I was going to do something big to a draft, is to put out a candidate version so that the main thread doesn't get contaminated if people really object to that approach.
Right, and one of the things I would suggest, both from a project management and tools perspective, the goal is to try to get more parallel work happening. And if we're serializing through a single author, you tend to have a lot of problems with that. If you're using a distributed version control system of some sort, people can just simply fork a branch, do some edits, say this is what I think it should look like, and then the main editor just simply says, yeah, it looks good, and instead of having to swap these edits back and forth across the email where context is lost over the large chain of emails, you just simply merge it in at the end.
Yes, but I think I was talking about running complicated changes past the working group.
I think the same tool is similarly useful. So just as a, for example, if you're doing your text inside of Git, then you can simply fork a branch, do your edits in there, and then you say, here's the URL to the version of this draft that includes all of the changes along with the diff.
I mean, I think there's a whole range of things you can do. It's just really, from a tooling perspective, but what it gets back down to is how do you present the information to people in a way that they can digest easily. The harder part is making sure you're getting proposed text edits out to people for review. If you do that frequently and often, you'll get good results and you'll make progress. If you don't, in practice, do that, everything is going to drag out.
So the problem with doing with, I think we need some better tooling actually, because I think the problem with Git is you're going to see the raw text, not the IETF draft, aren't you? So there would actually be a case, I suppose, for putting a personal 0.0 draft out and allowing the diff tool to work properly.
Right, so the practice that I tend to do when I'm doing this stuff is that the XML is the primary editing target, but before I actually check things in, I generate the text version and I potentially also generate a diff, the XML diff.
I'll leave that in the Git.
Those are just artifacts that are left along with the XML file. So this is all, all three things happen to live in the same set of files.
All right.
One of the things that definitely takes a lot of time is responding to all of the comments in email and going through and updating the draft. And I think it would be really useful to figure out and try out different tool chains, or whether it's SVN or GitHub or whatever, but different ways of seeing actual text modifications as opposed to just comments that you then have to go and hunt down and fix. I mean, this is the kind of thing where good tooling, I think, could really help make it easier for authors to get their work done. But I also agree with the comments that we are kind of rat-holing on some of the different aspects. Does anyone want to up-level for questions on the project management perspective, ideas for setting objectives, how to make this work better, what things you would like to see for another call, that kind of stuff?
Well, Thomas here, I'll just say that I would really encourage people to start with the goals. Do you have clear goals for your working group? And are those goals shared by your kind of key executive team / working group as a whole? Because that's the most important part. And then how do you make then what's your project plan for getting there? I mean, what do you want to do at the next IETF meeting in your working group? What do you want to have happen? Are you going to do a standard call for agenda items, and then whatever people volunteer, you'll put them on the agenda, or do you have 2 or 3 key things you want to have happen? And what are those, and how do you ensure that the right stuff happens between now and then, that you're going to have a presentation that actually makes decisions? Silence.
So to maybe try to force conversation to our ADs, do you think that our charters show that we actually have clear articulation of working group goals, And do you think that we actually have reasonable milestones of some form, either in the data tracker or somewhere scattered in the charter? If not, what should we do to fix that?
I think it depends very much on the working group. We have a lot of working groups which are in what I describe as maintenance mode. Oh, here, we'll take work that comes up related to this protocol or topic without having specific things in charter. And, you know, that's worked pretty well because we have a lot of really experienced, you know, chairs, and they do manage it. We also have some working groups which are sort of the newer ones where we're saying, here, these are your explicit milestones, and we'd like you to move on these rather quickly. So I think there's a mixture of the two. The charters are a tool both for the IESG to manage what each of the working groups is doing, but also to help the working group chairs manage what's happening and what's needed in the working group. So I'm certainly up to rewriting charters and updating them. I think each group is a, you know, separate one to talk about what's appropriate for it.
Yeah, I would just jump in. You know, absolutely you need to pay attention to what's in your charter, and your charter should be up to date. But I would not start by saying, you know, align your goals with your charter and make sure that the charter is in sync. This, you know, project management is about always understanding, having very clearly what it is you want to achieve and how to get there. The charters are just part of the process we have to go through to be a working group and all that stuff. And keeping those tightly in sync isn't your I wouldn't argue is the most important priority. It's keeping your eye focused on what it is you need to do in your working group to be successful. You know, within the bounds of the charter, obviously, but you know, if you spend too much time trying to sync the charter with your goals, you know, that's just not the place to spend your time. You're better off, you know, talking to people and getting your authors to agree to do stuff.
Yeah, I agree. The charter is broad, and the milestones are much coarser than what's necessary for project management to get those pieces moving along, and particularly for groups where it's essentially, I won't say maintenance, because what we've actually found is there's a lot of work going on there that isn't quite maintenance, but more like protocol extensions and so on. But the key point is it is focusing on moving the work along, thinking about when you would like to see it done and why, what's causing bottlenecks for particular drafts and so on, and how to unblock them. And obviously the project, sorry, go on. Sandy, did you want to say something?
I think I just said, I was thinking about this discussion with the idea of two different scopes of something that was being done in the IETF. A brand new protocol to address a newly identified need, or something like IPv8 or
Bad example.
A new version of MPLS, or something with very wide-ranging. It's going to impact everybody. And I was just trying to think if the techniques that are being discussed and apply, and if timeframes apply. I think a revision to OSPF or ISIS, or is going to. You may not want to set your goals with time frames that are, we want to get this done in 2 IETFs. It's affecting enough people. You may want the whole idea of changing something that wide-ranging to sink into a bunch of people before you declare that it's done. But I'm not certain that maybe the time frame should be that quick for even widely used systems.
So this is actually something that is a little bit more traditional project management analysis. If you have something that is big and therefore has some amount of trackable, this is going to take a lot of time to think about. More traditional tools for doing project management can help you there, because at that point you have you have to have some idea what big actually means. You have to have some idea of who's going to impact, who's going to have to contribute. So let's say that we've decided to do OSPF version 4, since AC has left the call. And we know here's the rough set of features that we're likely to include in it, and we want to do this in 2 IETFs. What that means is that we've taken it out of the usual slow path that we tend to do for our work, meaning that it doesn't necessarily matter who's working on something or how long it's going to take them individually, because it's the synchronization points for the milestones that become important. And it changes it to how long is the task actually going to take, who's actually going to work on it, and when can they actually work on it, so those calendaring questions. So once you've gotten to something that big, then it actually starts to matter. And this actually sort of rolls back to AC's question to me about what sort of happened with I2RS when Sue took over. By putting the group on a fast cadence to get stuff done, large numbers of interims to move things along, getting the design team set up for people to take care of things, it moves it back into more of a traditional project management type thing. But it also means the tracking level and the things you track become a lot more granular. And you have to spend a lot more time thinking about how long is a specific subtask going to take. And a lot of the challenge for traditional project management is, what is the task? What is the finest granular thing that makes sense to track? And what are the units they actually want to use to track that in terms of breaking it down, time, cost, et cetera. A lot of our work is smaller things where, again, it's just the milestones in the calendar that we care about. But once we start applying some time compression, then the other things actually start mattering. And one of the things that becomes awkward for the organization, this is one of the things that sort of bit us a little bit in terms of, like Dave Ward's talk about trying to be more agile compared to other organizations. In order to be that sort of agile, it has to be your day job. It has to be the place that you're living. And that is not, for the most part, where a number of the people that are active participants in various groups are doing. Where you do tend to see that actually happening is people have decided that it is important, and you have a small, tightly knit group of people that are iterating on it very quickly.
Thank you. So one aspect of what I was trying to articulate is, well, okay, so I said IPv8 and Tom said bad example. So let's talk about the V4 to V6 transition. There are people at ARIN who say they still go to companies to talk about V6, and the companies say, wait a minute, you mean to tell me we're running out of V4? And when something is that widespread in use and fundamental, and we're still seeing people talk about the problems in trying to deploy V6 because they, they're presentation after presentation about, oh, we didn't think about the fact that it impacts this, that, and the other thing. If you set your goals in terms of how long it's going to take you to get people who participate in IETF standards process to consider and come to agreement, that's one thing. But then there are the actual deployment and implementation experiences, which we know are going to feed back into the specification process. So we do business, and is that a good thing? Is it good to set a goal to come to a consensus in the IETF on the specification and then do BISs as we discover things that didn't work well on that spec?
So to some extent, I'm going to answer your question in the context of this topic with, it's the wrong question.
Yeah.
Project management is about taking a specific set of goals once they've been defined and executing on them, and the tools will do that. To some extent, what you're talking about is more of a traditional program management thing. Here's the set of things necessary to advance a bigger set of goals, whether they're tied to logistics or tied to tactics. It's a much bigger topic. There are a lot of bigger answers, but each of those types of things, once you've come to the answers that are appropriate for that realm of thinking, can devolve down into specific tasks that can be implemented, in which case project management discipline becomes important again.
Okay. I think I'll stop philosophizing now.
Well, let me turn it around, Sandy. A working group chair is responsible for many things. Part of it's project management. Part of it can be outreach, making sure that the necessary communities, working to help make sure the necessary communities are involved. We do have multiple levels of maturation for standards, and there's a reason for that. We also don't, for many of our protocols and many of our drafts require implementations. Those certainly implementations are extremely useful to have, and that's something that's on a working group by working group basis, what makes them feel the most comfortable. So, yeah, I mean, I agree that it's not, that's a higher level, what should we be managing as opposed to how do we manage.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We're at 12:25 now. Are there any more questions or comments? I'm going to turn off the recording if not, and we can talk a little bit more after that as well if desirable. Okay. Not hearing anything else, let me stop the recording. Thank you all very much.